This podcast is for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended as personalized recommendations or fiduciary advice. It is not intended to provide and should not be relied upon for any investment, accounting, legal, and tax advice or as a solicitation to offer or buy any securities. Clients of Northbound Wealth Management may maintain positions in the securities discussed in this podcast. Hello, everyone. This is Brent Foster, CEO of Northbound Wealth Management, and I just want to share with you guys a website that I like to review and look at, also share with clients. It's called investor.gov. It's put on by the United States Securities and Exchange Commission, or also known as the SEC. A lot of great fundamental information there. And I really encourage everyone who's listening to this podcast or who comes across this podcast to go out to that website. Foundational principles on investing. There's calculators. There's all kinds of information about how markets work, products in markets, and a lot of great resources. And I think it's beneficial for everyone to go there and learn about how the markets are working. All right. I'm going to kind of dive into investment products, and then I'll transition and gear that to risks. And then what we'll do is we'll get to fraud, Ponzi schemes. And I want to share some of that information with you as we are looking at the stock market at being all-time highs. Interest rates are coming down. The private markets, which is called also the primary markets, are going to be opening up more. And you'll see either if you're getting them now, or if you're not, you will probably get them in the future, as it seems like there's a big push to domesticate private markets or primary markets. What that means is try to solicit investors to invest in investments that are not easily tradable, illiquid, have long holding periods, and less transparency. And so in light of that, and in light of the solicitations from hedge funds and from private equity and venture capital funds, I want to just kind of help with some A, education, and B, as a warning, just to use some caution when you're evaluating those types of investments. So let's dive in. Investment products. This is from investor.gov. A wide variety of investment products exist to help you achieve your financial goals. Learn more about many investment products in the menu on the left and what they have. If you go to that website and you're looking at it, you'll see that they go through all kinds of different things: auction rate securities, bonds or fixed income products, CDs, closed-end funds, commodities, educational funds, insurance products, international investing, mutual funds, exchange-traded funds, options or derivatives, private investment funds, real estate investment funds, retirement savings stocks, structured notes, and they go through a lot. It's really a great site. So the main categories of investment products are, though, stocks, bonds, mutual funds, and exchange traded funds, or ETFs, insurance products such as variable annuities. Every investment product has its own set of features, including a level of risk and anticipated returns. So there's always a relationship between risk and return. The more risk you take, typically, you should have a higher return profile. So risk means how safe your money will be, and return is how fast your money will grow. Generally, as an investment risks rise, investors seek higher returns. Be careful, though. You can lose all the money you invest, including your principal. Risk and return aren't the only considerations when deciding what types of investment products to invest in. You may also want to consider the fees. So how much does it cost to invest? The asset allocation, diversification of your overall financial situation, liquidity, how easily it is to buy and sell the product. And then there's fraud, the potential for investment fraud. So is there a high potential or a low potential of investment fraud? And so the subject area I want us to cover, and what I will be covering, is more on the fraud side of things. So, what can you do to avoid investment fraud? Number one, ask questions. Fraudsters are counting on you not to investigate before you invest. Fend them off by doing your own digging. It's not enough to ask for more information or for references. Fraudsters have no incentive to set you straight. Take the time to do your own independent research. For more about information, you can ask questions to investor.gov. You can ask a lot of questions and they can try to help share answers to those questions. Research. Number two, research before you invest. Unsolicited emails. So if you get those, I get a ton of them. Message boards, postings, and company news releases should never be used as the sole basis for your investment decisions. Understand a company's business and its products or services before investing. Look for the company's financial statements on the SEC's Edgar filing system. That Edgar database is really, really good for due diligence. So if you're not familiar with it, try to type into Google Edgar database or SEC database. You can also check out many investments by going there. You can put in ticker symbols, you can put in QSIPs, and you'll learn all about this stuff. If you're a layman and don't care, that's fine. But if you're interested in learning more, you can always reach out to us at Northbound Wealth Management. So, number three, know the salesperson or the person that's pitching the investment. Spend some time checking out the person touting the investment before you invest. Even if you already know the person socially, always find out whether the securities salespeople who contact you are licensed to sell securities in your state and whether they or their firms have had run-ins with regulators or other investors. You can check out disciplinary history of brokers and advisors for free using the SEC and FINRA's online databases. Number four, be wary of unsolicited offers. That's a common one. So be especially careful if you receive an unsolicited pitch to invest in a company or see it praised online but can't find current financial information about it from independent sources. It could be a pump and dump scheme. Be wary if someone recommends foreign or offshore investments. If something goes wrong, it's harder to find out what happened and locate money sent abroad. Number five, protect yourself online. Online social marketing sites offer a wealth of opportunity for fraudsters. For tips on how to protect yourself online, see Protect Your Social Media Accounts on this website, investor.gov. And number six, know what to look for. So make yourself knowledgeable about different types of fraud and the red flags that may signal investment fraud. So red flags for fraud and common persuasion tactics. How do successful, financially intelligent people fall prey to investment fraud? Researchers have found that investment fraudsters hit their targets with an array of persuasion techniques that are tailored to the victim's psychological profile. Here are red flags to look for. If it sounds too good to be true, it is. Watch for phantom riches. Compare compromised yields with current returns on well-known stock indexes. Any investment opportunity that claims you'll receive substantially more could be highly risky, and that means you might lose money. Be careful of claims that an investment will make incredible gains, is, quote, a breakout stock pick, or has huge upside and almost no risk. Claims like these are hallmarks of extreme risk or outright fraud. Guaranteed returns aren't. So every investment carries some degree of risk, which is reflected in the rate of return that you can expect to receive. If your money is perfectly safe, you'll most likely get a low return. High returns entail high risks, possibly including total loss on the investments. Most fraudsters spend a lot of time trying to convince investors that extremely high returns are guaranteed or can't miss. They try to plant an image in your head of what your life would be like when you are rich. Don't believe it. Don't believe any of it. Okay, next, beware the halo effect. So investors can be blinded by a halo effect when a con artist comes across as likable or trustworthy. Credibility can be faked. Check out actual qualifications. The next one, everyone is buying it. So watch out for pitches that stress how everyone is investing in this, so should you. 2, think about whether you are interested in the product. If a sales presentation focuses on how many others have bought the product, this could be a red flag. The next section is pressure to send money right now. So, scam artists often tell their victims that this is a once in a lifetime offer and it will be gone tomorrow. But resist the pressure to invest quickly and take the time you need to investigate before sending money. Reciprocity. Fraudsters often try to lure investors through free investment seminars, figuring if they do a small favor for you, such as supplying a free lunch, you will do a big favor for them and invest in their product. There is never a reason to make a quick decision on an investment. If you attend a free lunch, take the material home and research both the investment and the individual selling it before you invest. Always make sure the product is right for you and that you understand what you are buying and all the fees associated with it. So, where can you go for help? If you have a question or concern about an investment or think that you've encountered one of these frauds, please contact the SEC, FINRA, or your state securities regulator to report the fraud and to get assistance. And on the investor.gov website, they have the contact information of all 3 of those bureaus. Next, we're going to talk about the types of fraud. So, investment fraud comes in many forms. Whether you're a first-time investor, have been investing for many years, here are some basic facts you should know about the different types of fraud. So, on their website, a whole bunch are listed. I'll just go quickly through the different titles. So, there's an affinity fraud, advance fee fraud, binary options fraud, high-yield investment programs, impersonation schemes, internet and social media fraud, micro-cap fraud, Ponzi schemes, pre-IPO investment scams, pyramid schemes, prime bank investments, promissory notes, pump and dump schemes. And then there's a few others in the commodities area of the market, which is a commodity pool fraud, foreign currency trading fraud, and precious metals fraud. Obviously, that's not like the entire list, but that's quite a few of them. Again, as a reminder, what can you do to avoid investment fraud? A basic understanding of how scam artists work can help you avoid fraud and protect your money. Learning how to invest wisely can help you reach your financial goals. Here are some of the ways to help avoid being scammed. So, number 1, be aware before you share contact information in response to an investment promotion. Number 2, learn what you can do to avoid investment fraud, including red flags to watch for and where to go for help. Number 3, learn how to protect yourself online and how to protect your social media accounts. Number 4, learn about the different types of investment fraud, including those found online and in social media. And number 5, review our investor alerts. So remember, if you have a question or concern about an investment or you think you've encountered a fraud, you can contact the SEC, FINRA, or your state securities regulator to report the fraud and to get assistance. And that is all found on the investor.gov website. Next, I'm going to provide some examples of recent history to try to help drive home this awareness. Stay tuned for the next segment. So, the aim of a Ponzi scheme is to generate income fraudulently for the operators of the scheme. It achieves this goal by posing as a legitimate investment vehicle for its unsuspecting victims. It offers a consistently high rate of return on the funds invested with little to no risk. Investors are led to believe that they will receive their promised returns based on the wise and typically unspecified investments made by the operators of the scheme. However, no such legitimate investments are made. And instead, the source of the returns paid to existing investors is the funds paid in by new investors. We could therefore define a Ponzi scheme as follows. A Ponzi scheme is a fraudulent investing scam promising high rates of return with little to no risk to investors, generating returns for earlier investors with money taken from later investors. Given this method of operation, it is clear that the ongoing success of a Ponzi scheme relies on the constant flow of new investors to maintain the flow of payments to older investors. If this flow of new investors dries up, the whole scheme can quickly fall apart. Another source of risk to the scheme's continuing operation is in cases where investors decide to withdraw the principal funds that they had previously paid into the scheme. To better understand how Ponzi schemes are perpetrated in the real world, let us review a couple of egregious examples that have been uncovered during the recent past, making headlines along the way as the extent of their fraudulent activities come to light. The Money Doctor. In the early 2000s, a Ponzi scheme was operating in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, masterminded by a man who called himself the Money Doctor. He hosted a weekly radio program that posed as a financial advice show, using it to attract investors to his fraudulent scheme. The Money Doctor, whose real name was William Neil Gallagher, claimed to have a PhD and decades of financial experience. On his radio program, he presented himself as an expert who wanted to help his listeners avoid investing mistakes by entrusting him to manage their money. He promised guaranteed returns and emphasized his Christian faith to build rapport with his target audience. So here's some background. One financial professional living in Texas in the early 2000s shares an interesting tale. Tax pro Steve was studying part-time for an MBA at the University of Dallas. He frequently made the hour-plus commute from Fort Worth to Dallas campus while listening to his favorite local AM radio station that played the type of music he enjoyed, which was Frank Sinatra, Tony Bennett, Dean Martin, and other artists from the 1940s and 50s. You may be asking yourself, why are you being told this trivial information? And you'll soon understand. The old-time music format led this station to feature the Money Doctor's weekly financial advice program. Steve explains that over time, the program raised some doubts. The Money Doctor claimed no losses for investors and guaranteed high returns. Still, there was no immediate connection to the potential major fraud at first. It was not until 2019 that the Securities and Exchange Commission, or the SEC, investigated and shut down the Money Doctor schemes. Reflecting back, the Fort Worth tax pro realized his long weekend drives and affinity for the golden oldies provided early exposure to a major Ponzi scheme. The AM station hosting the Money Doctor represented a small puzzle piece leading authorities to finally halt the fraud targeting elderly investors. The radio program's playlist was intended to attract a certain audience demographic, which was mainly composed of listeners aged 60 and above who remembered and enjoyed the style of music they had grown up with. But in a competitive broadcast market, the size of the audience for smooth, quiet oldies station would not be large enough to sustain the finances of the radio station unless it was supported by significant advertising revenue. One major source of revenue for the small radio stations could be derived from infomercials, in which companies bought airtime to produce a program that would promote their goods and services. These infomercials were broadcast to an audience of mostly retired, financially stable individuals. The 1-hour-long infomercial program on the station involved a financial discussion between a man who normally presented the weekday breakfast show and his guest, Dr. Neil Gallagher, alias the Money Doctor. The show was fairly informal in nature, but it was aimed at encouraging listeners to invest with the Gallagher Financial Group. During the show, listeners would call in for advice or sing the praises of the Money Doctor, and in between, the presenter would ask several scripted questions. And the pitch was, as Steve listened to the program, Dr. Gallagher emphasized that his PhD was not in the field of finance, but he chose to call himself the Money Doctor because he had learned much during his 60 or so years of life. Thus, he felt he could help his listening audience avoid the investing mistakes he had made in his younger years and fix any financial problems they had. In other words, he could diagnose their financial situation, recommend a cure, and provide further preventative protection just like a doctor. During the program, Dr. Gallagher would provide what sounded like very credible advice on many aspects of finances, including budgeting and succession planning, thus building a rapport with his audience. He also emphasized his Christian faith when possible and, in fact, signed off his show each week with the words, "See you in church on Sunday." As can be expected, for a program that was aimed at an audience of listeners age 60 and over, much of the financial discussion was related to saving and planning for retirement, and also managing one's finances in retirement. During these discussions, Dr. Gallagher would use the rapport he had established with the audience to empathize with the listeners' need to protect their assets in retirement. He was very skeptical about the stock market in general and would almost chuckle over its losses while downplaying the impact of its gains. He would say his clients never have to worry about what the stock markets, financial brokerage, or banks might do from one week to the next. Instead, they can sleep soundly because their money is invested safely with the Gallagher Financial Group. It all almost sounded too good to be true, but there was one turn of phase that Dr. Gallagher would use each week that tipped the balance. He would tell his listeners that they could invest in speculative other areas like the stock market if they chose to do so, but they must bear in mind that they could lose part or all of those investments. However, when it came to money that listeners can absolutely not afford to lose, they should invest it with his firm because their account balance will never go down. His catchphrase was thus, "Investors save money with me because you will never lose." So, potential investor analysis. Potential investors who were considering the above proposition could weigh the pros and cons as follows. Here's some pros. He's on the radio every week and sounds like he knows what he's doing. They would never let him on the radio if he was a crook. I am worried about losing money during retirement, and he seems to have a good plan. He sounds like a good Christian man who wants to help us. There are some nice video testimonials online, and people just love him. I'm guaranteed not to lose, not like the roller coaster stock market. He would never be asking for my safe money unless he knew I would never lose it. Lots of people smarter than me have already invested with him. He used to operate his business in Chicago before he came to Dallas. And then here are the cons that maybe some investors would think of. There is no such thing as a guaranteed no loss investment. He never talks about where he could actually invest my money. Those are the cons. Here's the outcome. Many people were drawn in by the money doctor's appealing promises and trusted persona. However, in 2019, he came under investigation from the SEC and his Ponzi scheme ultimately unraveled, revealing that he had swindled investors out of millions of dollars over the years. The money doctor was sentenced to multiple lifetime prison sentences for his financial crimes. So here's the headlines. SEC charges Texas radio host The Money Doctor, halts Ponzi scheme targeting elderly investors. And Securities and Exchange Commission versus William Neal Doc Gallagher, Gallagher Financial Group, and W. Neal Gallagher, PhD Agency, Incorporated, under case number 319-CV0575-C. And it was filed March 7th, 2019, so you can look this up. The SEC announced that it charged Texas resident William Neal Doc Gallagher, the self-styled money doctor, featured on 3 Dallas area radio stations, in an emergency action to shut down a $19.6 million Ponzi scheme targeting elderly investors and retirement funds. The SEC also charged Gallagher Financial Group and Dr. William W. Neal Gallagher, PhD Agency, companies that Gallagher used to carry out the scheme. So the SEC's complaint, filed under seal on March 7, 2019, alleged that Gallagher made frequent religious references on his radio shows to establish his standing among a target audience of retired Christian investors. From December 2014 through January 2019, he raised at least $19.6 million from approximately 60 senior citizens. Falsely claiming to be a licensed investment advisor, he offered an investment that he called a diversified growth and income strategy account, in which he promised to acquire income-generating assets for his clients in 5 specified categories. He promised investors that he would receive guaranteed risk-free returns in their accounts ranging from 5% to 8% per year. In reality, Except for one $75,000 annuity purchase, Gallagher purchased no assets in any of the 5 categories and no other assets to back the promised returns. Instead, he exhausted virtually all investors' funds on spending unrelated to the accounts, including misappropriating significant portions for financial, personal, and company expenses and making Ponzi payments to investors. To lull investors and conceal the scheme, Gallagher provided investors phony account statements showing false account balances. Although the SEC placed the money doctor under investigation in 2019, the full extent of his swindling was not discovered until later. He was eventually sentenced as follows. So, a Texas radio host was sentenced 3 life prison terms on Monday for a Ponzi scheme in which he bilked elderly listeners out of millions of dollars. He got 30-year prison sentence from State District Judge Elizabeth Beach for his August guilty pleas. The sentences are to be served concurrently. The sentencing came after more than a dozen senior victims testified during a 3-hour court hearing about losing anywhere between $50,000 to $600,000 invested in the Gallagher Financial Group. Some said that they had to sell their homes, borrow money from their children, or take part-time jobs to supplement their Social Security benefits. Doc Gallagher is one of the worst offenders I've seen, said Lori Varnell, chief of the Tarrant County District Attorney's Elder Financial Frauds Team. Gallagher 80 and his Gallagher Financial Group advertised on Christian radio with the tagline, "See you in church on Sunday." He promoted his investment in business and books such as Jesus Christ, Money Master, and on Christian radio broadcasts. Gallagher has been behind bars since his March 2019 arrest on similar charges filed in Dallas County. In 2020, he pleaded guilty to those charges and was sentenced to 25 years in prison. He was indicted in Tarrant County in August 2019. He ruthlessly stole from his clients who trusted him for almost a decade. He amassed $32 million in losses to all of his clients and exploited many elder individuals. He worked his way around churches, preying on people who believed he was a Christian, Varnell said in a statement. As the old saying goes, if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is. This was a lesson learned by the unsuspecting souls who were duped by Neil Gallagher. But the money doctor pales in comparison to our next master swindler, Bernard Madoff. While very few Americans would have been familiar with the term Ponzi scheme at the beginning of the 21st century, in 2008, a financier named Bernard "Bernie" Madoff captured the attention of the nation when he was indicted for running the largest Ponzi scheme in history. This elaborate scheme had defrauded thousands of investors out of tens of billions of dollars over the course of at least 17 years. So here's some background. Bernie Madoff was born 1938 and had worked for a number of years in the financial industry in New York and had been the chair of NASDAQ, the stock exchange, for several years in the early 1990s. He and his brother Peter had been pioneers in the field of electronic trading, which attracted massive order flow for his firm and sparked the migration of many other firms into electronic trading. By the early 1990s, he had thus established a trusted reputation throughout the financial industry for both himself and his firm, Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities LLC, which he had founded in 1960. Unlike the money doctor, based in his local community in Dallas, Madoff was based on Wall Street in the heart of the American financial industry. As such, Madoff had access to clients from all over the country, and his firm appeared to be a solid, trustworthy destination for funds of investors who would avoid smaller players such as the money doctor. Along with having a good personal reputation, Madoff also delivered strong returns for his investors and attracted a number of high-profile clients such as Steven Spielberg, actors Kevin Bacon and Kyra Sedgwick, and New York Mets owner Fred Wilpon. When interviewed in 1992, Madoff credited the strong returns on his investments to a new option strategy that he had begun using 10 years earlier. The basic strategy was to be long on a broad-based portfolio of S&P securities and hedged with derivatives, such as futures and options. Such a strategy, he said, allowed the investors to participate in an upward market move while having limited downside risk. Another method that Madoff claimed as the source of his large and steady returns was an investing strategy called split strike conversion. But in reality, he was not investing his clients' funds at all. In fact, he would simply deposit the funds into a single account at Chase Manhattan Bank that he would then use to pay existing clients who wanted to cash out. Meanwhile, his firm continued to pay commissions to agents recruiting new investors that were constantly needed to keep his Ponzi scheme afloat. But Madoff was no slacker in the recruitment game, but using his friendship with one of the officers at Manhattan's Fifth Avenue Synagogue to approach congregants. According to various accounts, Madoff swindled some $2.4 billion from the members of the synagogue. Through this series of activities to create and run his Ponzi scheme, Madoff was able to provide a constant stream of returns to his investors, regardless of what was happening in the market, for at least 17 years. So here's the pitch. Just like the money doctor, Madoff cultivated a stable and experienced image designed to ensure investors that not only was their money safe, but it would also return outstanding dividends, 10 to 20%, regardless of what the markets were doing. This image of trustworthiness was enhanced by the fact that Madoff's wife, sons, and brother all worked with him. Potential investors were reassured that Madoff would only invest their funds in blue chip stocks, but thanks to the sophisticated and complex investment techniques he had developed over decades-long career on Wall Street, he could deliver returns well above the market average. Another cunning technique Madoff used to lure investors into his scheme was to create a climate of exclusivity. So potential clients were, in effect, pre-screened to determine whether they would be allowed to invest with Madoff. Many were turned away, which had the effect of building what seemed like an exclusive club of people who were permitted to invest. The likely impact on the would-be investors would be that they would be able to increase the amount of their proposed investments in order to improve their chances of being accepted. Existing investors, in turn, would likely feel an increased loyalty to Madoff for making them feel special as accredited members of the exclusive club, along with several famous names. So here's a potential investor analysis. Potential investors who are considering the above proposition could weigh the pros and cons. Here are the pros. What's not to like about a 10 to 20% return on my money? He has been on Wall Street with his own firm for 40 plus years. He used to be the chair of the NASDAQ. He's a good, honest man of faith. He would never have survived on Wall Street if he was a crook. He only invests in blue chip stocks. His whole family works with him. Look at all the movie stars that have invested with him. Only a selected type of person is eligible to invest with them. He must be an investing genius to get such good returns for so long. I'm guaranteed not to lose, no matter what the market does. Lots of other people smarter than me have already invested with him. The cons are there's no such thing as a guaranteed no-loss investment. I don't understand how he invests my money. Just as with the money doctor, the number of reasons for investing with Madoff far outweighed the reasons against it. But once again, for many people, the thought of easy money overpowered any reservations they may have had. So here's the outcome. At various times during his many years of operations, questions were raised by industry insiders and some journalists about how Madoff's investment business could be so successful for so long. But no red flags were raised, and Madoff continued to run his fraudulent scheme. Finally, in January 2006, the SEC launched an investigation. SEC agents interviewed Madoff in his office in May of that year and noted that he appeared nervous. A year later, it closed the case, saying it found no evidence of fraud. After Madoff's interview and his voluntary production of documents, and so business continued as usual until 2008, when the collapse of The Lehman Brothers financial organization led to the global financial crisis that affected markets all around the world. By November, the US markets were down 40%, and hundreds of hedge funds either shut down or stopped allowing withdrawals. Nevertheless, the Madoff funds were still recording positive returns, which encouraged some of the firm's large hedge fund clients to invest even more money with Madoff. Meanwhile, Madoff himself was facing a liquidity crisis because so many of his clients were calling to redeem their investments. So by the first week of December, Madoff was facing requests for $7 billion in redemptions, money he did not have. Thus, one of the two fatal weaknesses of a Ponzi scheme were exposed. Such schemes cannot survive if too many investors are trying to redeem their funds at the same time. As mentioned earlier, the other fatal weakness of a Ponzi scheme is when it runs out of new investors. So, rather ironically, Madoff had no shortage of investors, but his scheme was brought down by the global forces outside his control. The end came when Madoff confessed to his sons at his apartment, according to investigators, the investment advisory business is a fraud, that he is finished, and that he has absolutely nothing, and that the operation was basically a giant Ponzi scheme. He estimates that the fraud to be approximately $50 billion. Madoff pleaded guilty to 11 felonies in 2009, with prosecutors estimating he defrauded around $65 billion from his clients. He was sentenced to 150 years in federal prison and died there in 2021 at the age of 82. Just as we saw with the case of the money doctor, the Ponzi scheme of Madoff's had both financial and personal impacts on its victims, but at a much larger scale with Madoff. Forbes magazine summed up the whole saga as follows when reporting on Madoff's death. The scope of Madoff's crimes shocked and infuriated the American public during the country's biggest economic downturn since the Great Depression. Major celebrity investors in Madoff's hedge fund like Steven Spielberg, Kevin Bacon, John Malkovich brought further attention to the case. Madoff claims he started the scheme in the 1990s, saying that was the last time he actively traded, and all returns he reported since that time were made up. Prosecutors say the fraud started earlier, like the beginning of the 1970s. In any case, Madoff's fraud remained largely undetected until the financial crisis of the late 2000s. Several members of Madoff's family were involved in this hedge fund, though they claimed to have no knowledge it was a Ponzi scheme. His two sons, Mark and Andrew Madoff, confronted their father on December 10, 2008, over a plan to give bonuses to employees ahead of schedule in December of 2008, where the elder Madoff admitted his business was based on a lie and collapsing as the markets plummeted. The two brothers went to the police, and Bernie Madoff was arrested the next day. Mark Madoff hanged himself in a Manhattan apartment on December 11, 2010, 2 years to the day after his father's arrest. Andrew Madoff died of lymphoma in 2014, blaming the return of his cancer on stress caused by his father's crimes. So what we've seen in these cases, we can understand how the SEC has been able to start putting together a list of common characteristics to help us identify future schemes and warn clients accordingly. So here's some hallmarks of a Ponzi scheme. Regardless of the technology used in Ponzi schemes, most share similar characteristics. So here are the red flags the SEC has identified common traits to watch for. A guaranteed promise of high returns with little risk, a consistent flow of returns regardless of market conditions, investments that have not been registered with the SEC, investment strategies that are secret or described as too complex to explain, clients not allowed to view official paperwork for their investment, clients facing difficulties removing their money. Schemes to deceive individuals and use fraudulent methods to steal their money are nothing new. But Ponzi schemes, such as described in this chapter, are particularly dangerous to the well-being of unsuspecting consumers. They take advantage of the human desire to make easy money and create a false sense of trust by assuring their victims that the perpetrator of the scheme is a fine, upstanding citizen. Once a large enough pool of investors has been recruited to get the scheme off the ground, other victims willingly follow in the false belief that they are in safe company. Sam Bankman-Fried crypto fraud scheme. Most people are familiar with the massive fraud at the FTX crypto exchange. Sam Bankman-Fried has been charged in the huge cryptocurrency Ponzi scheme. FTX's value has risen to $32 billion, used mainly to fund Bankman-Fried's lavish lifestyle and significant contributions to political candidates. FTC sold shares purportedly held at its exchange for investors. As it turns out, that wasn't how the funds were actually used. At least $8 billion in customer funds remained unaccounted for during the initial arrests and bankruptcy filings. The SEC and Commodity Futures Trading Commission, or CFTC, each began investigations and sought civil charges against Bankman-Fried. However, the filing of criminal charges put the SEC and CFTC actions on hold. As the funds started to disappear, Bankman-Fried continued to make more and more misrepresentations and misleading statements. In other words, recommitting the offense. Several of his fellow executives have made deals with the Department of Justice. So Sam Bankman-Fried, the founder of the cryptocurrency exchange FTX, was sentenced to 25 years in prison on March 28, 2024, so earlier this year. SBF, he's 32 years old, of Stanford, California, will have 3 years of supervised release in order to pay $11 billion in forfeiture for his orchestration of multiple fraudulent schemes. So the charges found SBF guilty of 7 counts of fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering. The charges included misusing billions of dollars of customer funds for his own personal use, defrauding investors, and lying to creditors. His sentence is going to be served in like a low to medium security prison near his parents' home in the San Francisco Bay Area. And the sentence was shorter than the 40 to 50 years sought by prosecutors, but is still one of the longest sentences given to a white-collar defendant in recent years. And the judge's reasoning behind that, Judge Lewis Kaplan, said that SBF's thinking was such that he needed to be deterred committing or recommitting further crimes. Kaplan cited a comment by Carolyn Ellison, the former CEO of Alameda Research, about how SBF thinks about the world. And by the way, Carolyn Ellison was SBF's girlfriend. So that gets interesting. It does not pay to be a fraud. On to the next segment. So in the next segment, we'll see what steps the IRS has taken to guide people tasked with helping those taxpayers who have fallen victim to a Ponzi scheme. Stay tuned for the next segment. In the previous segments, we looked at the nature of Ponzi schemes, both in general and more specifically with a review of well-known Ponzi schemes that operated during the first 2 decades of the 21st century. Those discussions focused on the actions of perpetrators, but did not provide any insight into how the victims of these schemes could recover their ill-fated investments. In this segment, we will discuss the IRS's response to victims of Ponzi schemes and their methods, and the methods that victims can use to minimize the tax aspects of their unfortunate losses. So, as we saw in the previous chapter, individual taxpayers and some corporations have lost enormous amounts of money in Ponzi schemes such as that operated by Bernie Madoff, Sam Bankman-Fried, and Dr. Neil Gallagher. However, as can be expected, victims of a Ponzi scheme are generally unlikely to be able to recover the entirety of their funds they invested with the promoters of the fraud. The luxury lifestyles often enjoyed by fraudsters do not lend themselves to the recovery of the full amounts invested in the crooked enterprise. Although the ownership of certain real estate properties and other tangible assets can be traced back to the fraud's perpetrators, the crooked enterprise's very nature is based on avoiding paper trails that investigators can follow. It can, therefore, take years of careful research by forensic accountants to unwind the complex ownership structure employed by the fraudsters, and only then can the assets be sold so that the victims can be repaid part of their original investment. Although the sale of a seized beach house in Bermuda can allow for the recovery of a certain amount of victims' investments, it is impossible to recover the funds spent on lifestyle luxuries such as elaborate family skiing vacations in the Swiss Alps and expensive dinners in Michelin-starred restaurants around the world. In an effort to try to reduce the impact of monetary losses suffered by victims of the Madoff fraud, the Department of Justice Asset Forfeiture Distribution Program established the Madoff Victim Fund in 2017. As of September 2022, the fund had paid out a total of more than $4 billion to 40,454 victims of the Madoff scheme. By December 2022, the total amount of repayments to victims exceeded $14 billion. Considering that Madoff pleaded guilty in 2009 to operating a Ponzi scheme, many of his victims have had to wait a long time to recover their losses. Given the enormous size of the losses and the number of victims involved in Madoff's scheme, the IRS recognized the need to step forward to offer guidance on how the losses should be handled for tax purposes. So, the tax treatment of a Ponzi loss. So, although Ponzi schemes were not a new phenomenon in the financial world, nothing of the size of the Madoff scheme had ever been seen before. As a result, the IRS needed to set ground rules for handling the affairs of taxpayers who had been tangled in Madoff's web. So then there was this Revenue Ruling 2009-09, and I believe it's called the Madoff Rule, but we'll get to that. As a first step in this process, the IRS issued Revenue Ruling 2009-09 to provide guidance on the key issues that financial professionals were facing and the questions they were asking. The opening section of the document cut right to the heart of the matter for financial professionals. So some of the issues are, is a loss from a criminal fraud or embezzlement in a transaction entered into for a profit a theft loss or a capital loss under Section Code 165 of the IRC code, which is the Internal Revenue Code. Number two, is such a loss subject to either the personal loss limits in Section Code 165H or the limits on itemized deductions in Section Code 67 and 68. Number three, in what year is such a loss deductible? Number four, how is the amount of such a loss determined? Number five, can such a loss create an increase, a net operating loss under Section Code 172? Number six, does such a loss qualify for the computation of tax provided by Section Code 1341 for the restoration of an amount held under a claim of right? Number seven, does such a loss qualify for the application of Section Code 1311 to 1314 to adjust tax liability in years that are otherwise barred by the period of limitations on filing a claim for refund under Section Code 6511? Let's review the first few issues on this list. And as we'll see, there are many facets to each of them, some of which are beyond the scope of this particular educational material that I'm presenting to you. The issue number one is theft loss. At first glance, the losses incurred by Ponzi victims could conceivably be classified as capital losses because they were losses on an investment of capital by the taxpayer. And as we are aware, under the tax code, the amount of capital loss that can be deducted each year is limited. However, the same section of the code also allows for the deduction of losses caused by theft. The matter is to be decided is whether the taxpayer's losses occurred because of an unsteady investment or because of theft. For example, a taxpayer who loses money when a stock he purchased becomes worthless due to mismanagement by the company suffers a capital loss. But a taxpayer who loses money because the company never intended to do anything but take the funds for their own purposes suffers a theft loss. In other words, the classification of the loss depends on the intentions of those individuals who received the invested funds. According to the IRS, a taxpayer claiming a theft loss must prove that the loss resulted from the taking of property that was illegal under the law of the jurisdiction in which it occurred and was done with criminal intent. In the Madoff situation, the IRS ruled that Madoff specifically intended to and took action to deprive investors or taxpayers of money through criminal acts. Therefore, Madoff's actions constituted a theft defined for the purpose of Section Code 165, and the loss incurred by the individual taxpayers is a theft loss and not a capital loss. Issue number 2 is deduction limitations. So in the matter in question here is whether the taxpayer's deduction for a casualty loss from a Ponzi scheme should be subject to the limitations imposed by Section Code 165. These limitations apply to the losses of property not connected either with the trade or business or with a transaction not entered into for profit. As described in the Revenue Ruling 0909, Section Code 165H1 provides that a deduction for a loss described in Section Code 165C3, including a theft, is allowable only to the extent that the amount exceeded $100. Section Code 165H2 provides that if personal casualty losses for any taxable year, including theft losses, exceeded personal casualty gains for the taxable year, the losses are allowed only to the extent of the sum of the gains, plus so much of the excess exceeds 10% of the individual's adjusted gross income. Without going into the intricate details of the discussion, the IRS has decided that taxpayers who open an investment account with a Ponzi scheme operator were entering into a transaction for profit, and thus their losses are deductible under Section Code 165C2 and are not subject to the 165H limitation. Furthermore, the IRS determined that these losses can be deducted as an itemized deduction that is not subject to the limits normally placed on itemized deductions by Section Code 67 and 68. Issue number 3 is the year of the deduction. Now that the questions of the nature of the taxpayer's loss have been addressed, along with the method for claiming a deduction, the next matter is how to decide in which year those losses should be deducted. The opaque nature of a Ponzi scheme makes it very hard to determine in which actual year a taxpayer's losses occurred. For example, Kathy invested $500 per month with the money doctor from 2006 to 2010. During that period, she received a total of $5,000 in dividends. She knows that she has lost $25,000, 60 months times $500 less $5,000, but it is impossible to identify exactly when those losses occurred. At what point did her investments become unrecoverable? Was it in the mid-2007 that the money doctor decided her investment belonged to him and not to her? Even if that were the case, it would be an impossible task to determine the ownership of the commingled funds in the fraudster's account from year to year. And when Kathy did receive a, quote, dividend, was it a return of capital or simply a fictitious amount paid from the capital invested by other victims? Given the complexity of this and other issues, the IRS decided to release further guidance in the form of Rev Procedure 2009 to 2020. So, although Rev Procedure 0909 describes the proper tax treatment for losses that result from Ponzi and other fraudulent schemes, the IRS recognizes that it is often very difficult to determine with any certainty the amounts and tax years in which the taxpayer's losses took place. Accordingly, Revenue Procedure 2009 to 20 was issued to provide further clarification for taxpayers and their financial professionals. This ruling is often referred to as the Madoff ruling because it was issued in response to the need for clarity created by the large number of victims of the Madoff scheme. The purpose of this document is to simplify the processes facing taxpayers who have experienced losses in Ponzi schemes and certain other investment arrangements that were later discovered to be criminally fraudulent. The document thus sets out an optional safe harbor treatment for taxpayers seeking to claim a deduction for their losses. Also described is how the IRS will treat a return claiming a deduction for such a loss and not choosing to use the safe harbor treatment. So there's an optional safe harbor. The aim of this part of the revenue procedure is to provide a uniform method for qualified investors to determine their theft losses. Using this treatment avoids potentially difficult problems of proof in determining how much income reported in prior years was fictitious or a return of capital, and alleviates compliance and administrative burdens on both taxpayers and the IRS. The safe harbor procedures can be used by taxpayers who are qualified investors under the definitions in the revenue procedure. For most relevant of these definitions for our purposes are specified fraudulent arrangement. So a specified fraudulent arrangement, it's an arrangement in which a party, the lead figure, receives cash or property from investors, purports to earn income for the investors, reports income amounts to the investors that are potentially or wholly fictitious, makes payments, if any, of purported income or principal to some investors from amounts that other investors invested in the fraudulent arrangement, and appropriates some or all the investors' cash or property. Qualified loss. A qualified loss is a loss resulting from a specified fraudulent arrangement in which, as a result of the conduct that caused the loss, the lead figure or one of the lead figures, if more than one, was charged by indictment or information, not withdrawn or dismissed, under state or federal law with the commission of fraud, embezzlement, or a similar crime that, if proven, would meet the definition of theft for purposes of Section Code 165 of the Internal Revenue Code. A qualified investor means a U.S. person as defined under Section Code 7701A30 that generally qualifies to deduct theft losses under Section Code 165. 165A. Number two, that did not have actual knowledge of the fraudulent nature of the investment arrangement prior to it becoming known to the general public. And then the discovery year, remember the year that we're trying to figure out when this happened. So a qualified investor's discovery year is the taxable year of the investor in which the indictment, information, and complaint described in Section 4.02 of this revenue procedure is filed. So if a qualified investor follows the safe harbor procedures outlined in the revenue procedure, the IRS will not challenge the following aspects of a taxpayer's treatment of their loss. So number one, the loss is deducted as a theft loss. Number two, the taxable year in which the theft was discovered within the meaning of Section Code 165E is the discovery year, which is described in this revenue procedure. And then number three, the amount of deduction is the amount specified in this revenue procedure. The safe harbor method also takes into account the matter of actual or potential recovery of funds from the fraudulent scheme. And then we got to go to the amount to be deducted. So the amount specified in this section 5.02 is calculated as follows. Number one, multiply the amount of the qualified investment by 95% for a qualified investor does not pursue any potential third-party recovery, or by 75% for a qualified investor that is pursuing or intends to pursue any potential third-party recovery. And two, subtract from this product the sum of any actual recovery and any potential insurance or SIPC recovery. Taxpayers who use the safe harbor method must complete Section C of Form 4684, Casualties and Thefts, for their federal income tax return for the discovery year. They must also mark Revenue Procedure 2009 to 20 at the top of Form 4684. So, choosing not to use the safe harbor, those taxpayers who choose not to use the safe harbor method to claim a theft loss are potentially subject to examination by the IRS. They are also subject to all the generally applicable provisions governing the deductibility of losses under Section Code 165. This will mean, for example, that a taxpayer must establish the following: that the loss was from theft and that the theft was discovered in the year they claim the deduction. And then the amount of the claim loss, supporting documentation will likely be required to do that. And then that no claim for the reimbursement of any portion of the loss exists with the respect to which there is a reasonable prospect of recovery in the taxable year in which the taxpayer claims the loss. Taxpayers who choose not to use the safe harbor method must complete Section B of Form 4684, Casualties and Thefts, for their federal income tax return for the discovery year. To summarize, we can reasonably conclude that due to its simplicity and protection from examination, most taxpayers who qualify to use the safe harbor method are very likely to choose that option. So in this section, we touched on the complexities faced by financial professionals as they seek to understand, and it's not only financial professionals, it's investors too, the tax treatment of losses from Ponzi schemes. We then looked at guidance offered by the IRS and reviewed the documents issued by the IRS to address the major issues involved in untangling these complex schemes. We then reviewed the solution offered by Safe Harbor scheme that would simplify the reporting situation immensely for both victims and the financial professionals who are trying to help them. In the remaining sections, we'll present and discuss several court cases in which the guidance we've seen in this chapter is applied to individual victims of Ponzi schemes. In the previous section, we discussed the definition of a Ponzi scheme, examined some recent examples, and viewed the general guidelines issued by the IRS to help financial professionals manage the process of claiming deductions by their clients who have been affected. In this section, we'll review 3 court cases that will offer insight into how the tax code and recent guidance offered by the IRS are applied in practice to support the deduction of theft losses by victims of Ponzi schemes. And again, consult your legal and tax professional on all this information. This is for educational purposes only. State the discovery year that should be used by a taxpayer who plans to use a safe harbor method to deduct their losses from a Ponzi scheme, and then identify the section of tax code that deals with losses suffered by states. So the discovery year for the safe harbor deduction. In the case of Gambron et al. Versus Commissioner 19 in 2020, the tax court was called upon to arbitrate the matter of the year in which the safe harbor deduction offered in Revenue Procedure 2009-20 could be claimed by a taxpayer who was the victim of a Ponzi scheme. As we saw in the last section, the taxpayer must claim his loss in the discovery year as defined by the revenue procedure. The discovery year is defined as qualified investor's discovery year is the taxable year of the investor in which the indictment, information, or complaint described in Section 4.02 of the Rev procedure is filed. The lead figure in the Ponzi scheme in this fraudulent scheme was Mr. Farkas. The tax court opinion in this case describes the action against him as follows. On June 15, 2010, a federal grand jury returned an indictment against Mr. Farkas, charging him with conspiracy and bank, wire, and securities fraud. According to the indictment, Mr. Farkas had devised a scheme to misappropriate over $1 billion in funds from various financial institutions, including TBW, the FHLMC, which is the Government National Mortgage Association, and the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP. A jury convicted Mr. Farkas on April 19, 2011. He later was sentenced to 30 years in prison. The Gallagher had invested in the scheme and were the victims of its fraud. However, even though Mr. Farkas was indicted in 2010, the Giambros did not claim a loss under Revenue Procedure 2009-20 until the filing of their 2012 income tax return, as the tax court opinion notes. The Giambros claimed theft loss deductions of 95% of their value of investments in platinum on their 2012 federal income tax returns. The Giambros premised their claim deduction on Rev Proc 2009-20, which provides an optional safe harbor treatment for taxpayers that experience losses in certain investment arrangements discovered to be criminally fraudulent. The IRS challenged the deduction, noting that if the taxpayers were going to use the safe harbor treatment offered by the Rev procedure, then they were required to do so on their 2010 tax return, as that was the year Mr. Farkas was indicted. The taxpayers argued that limiting the discovery year to a single year in which the lead figure is indicted is incompatible with other sections of the tax code, namely IRC Section Code 165E and Reg 165-1D3. As it began its analysis, the court noted that the revenue procedure is not binding on the tax court, and therefore, even if the Giambros were to establish that the IRS had erred in its application of Rev Proc 2009-20, we would not be required to conclude that they were entitled to claim the theft loss deductions. The court noted that the taxpayers conceded that they did not request the safe harbor treatment on their 2010 income tax returns, and it goes on to say that the taxpayers were in error when they argue that the safe harbor must include the broader view of the discovery year found in other parts of the tax code and its associated regulations. The Gaiambrones are laboring under the fundamental misconception Rev Proc 2009-20 is not required to comport with the terms of Section 165 or the accompanying regulation. It is an exercise of administrative discretion on the part of the IRS, offering beneficial treatment for categories of theft losses meeting certain well-defined conditions. The Gaiambrones cannot gain the benefit of it without adhering to its conditions the IRS imposed. The court agreed that the taxpayers could indeed use 2012 as the discovery year if they made use of other section codes, but under these laws, the taxpayers would face other limitations in claiming their losses. The safe harbor in the revenue procedure was designed to simplify the procedure for claiming their losses. The Service and Treasury Department recognized that whether and when investors meet the requirements for claiming a theft loss for an investment in a Ponzi scheme are highly factual determinations that often cannot be made by taxpayers with certainty in the year the loss was discovered. In view of the number of investment arrangements recently discovered to be fraudulent and the extent of the potential losses, this revenue procedure provides an optional safe harbor under which qualified investors, as defined in Section Code 403, of this revenue procedure may treat a loss as theft loss deduction when certain conditions are met. This treatment provides qualified investors with a uniform manner for determining their theft losses. In addition, this treatment avoids potentially difficult problems of proof in determining how much income reported in prior years was fictitious or a return of capital, and alleviates compliance administrative burdens on both taxpayers and the service. In other words, the taxpayers have the right to make use of the broader view of the discovery year in Section Code 165, but if they take that path, they will also have to take on the burdens of dealing with all the requirements of applying the law that the safe harbor was designed to help them avoid. Thus, the tax court view is that taking the safe harbor to deduct Ponzi scheme losses is an all or nothing proposition. The IRS is not obligated to allow taxpayers to use parts of the safe harbor that are favorable to them and ignore those portions that present problems in their case. And I've got the resources of the section code there listed, and I'll have that in the show notes. So, calculating the amount of loss. At first glance, one would not think it is a difficult matter for a taxpayer to determine exactly how much they have lost in a Ponzi scheme, but the matter can become more complex when different ownership entities are involved. We'll now review 3 tax court cases that illustrate this point. So, the first one is H.J.H. Hinsdale LLC. So, in the case of Henry J. Half and Diane M. Liz Half versus Commissioner, the taxpayer, Mr. Half, formed a joint venture in 2005 through his own single member LLC, which was H.J.H. Hinsdale LLC, together with Grant Street Investors LLC, which is known as Grant Street. The new enterprise was called GSH Development LLC, and its purposes were to develop condominiums and townhomes in Hillsdale, Illinois. Grant Street was owned by Wex Trust Capital, although the tax regulations state that GSH should be treated as a partnership for federal tax purposes. GSH never filed a Form 1065 or provided its partners with a Schedule K-1. So during the next 5 years, Mr. Half made $1 million initial investment with GSH and contributed an additional $337,690 to GSH to cover various expenses. However, on August 11, 2008, the SEC filed a complaint in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York against the owners of Wex Trust, alleging that Wex Trust was a Ponzi scheme. A court-appointed receiver determined that continued development of GSH project was not economically viable. As a result, Mr. Half concluded that his entire investment in GSH was lost. For the 2009 tax year, the taxpayer claimed a bad debt expense deduction of $2,068,000 thereabouts on account of that lost investment. This amount was made up of the $1,337,690 that Mr. Half contributed to GSH and the $730,786 that he claimed that GSH owed him as fees for his services to the company in development, sales, marketing, and construction. He had never actually received that $730,000 and change, and Thus, this amount had never been included for income tax purposes. In processing his return, the IRS denied the full amount of the taxpayer's bad debt deduction. However, it did allow a theft loss deduction for the amount that he had contributed to GSH. However, it limited the theft loss deduction to $1,317,004 instead of the full amount, which was $1,337,690, because it considered that the deduction was subject to itemized deduction limitations. The IRS later realized that it was an error and that the taxpayer's losses should be exempt from itemized deduction limitations, so they got rid of that. The taxpayer's view was that the additional $730,000 is deductible as a theft loss according to the safe harbor set forth in Rev Proc 2009-20. But in reviewing the case, the court noted that the amount of the theft loss that is deductible generally is limited to the adjusted basis of the property taken. In this case, the taxpayer lost his entire investment in the partnership in addition to the money that he was owed but never received. In other words, the taxpayer's basis in the partnership was reduced to zero. Thus, to calculate the deductible amount of his loss, we must first calculate his basis in the partnership before the downfall. So, according to the court, under Section 705, a partner's basis generally is composed of contributions to the partnership plus his or her distributive share of partnership income, less distributions and his or her distributive share of partnership losses or expenses. Basis does not include the value of services performed unless and until the value of those services has been subjected to tax. Therefore, the court's position was that the taxpayer's theft loss under Section 165 was the $1,337,690 that he had contributed to the partnership. The taxpayer did not dispute this point, but he argued that the safe harbor provision outlined in Rev Proc 2009-20 applied to his case and could be used to allow a loss deduction for amounts not previously included in income. So, for example, the amounts owed to him by GSH. The court's response was that even if the Rev Proc safe harbor applied to the case, it specifically defines qualified investments to be, in part, the total amount of income with respect to the specified fraudulent arrangement that, consistent with information received from the specified fraudulent arrangement, the qualified investor included in income for federal tax purposes for all taxable years prior to the discovery year, including taxable years for which a refund is barred by the statute of limitations. And it specifically excludes from qualified investments in C, amounts reported to the qualified investor as taxable income that were not included in gross income on the investor's federal income tax returns. As noted, the taxpayer had never included any portion of the $730,786 in income in previous years. Thus, the tax court ruled that the taxpayer is entitled to a theft loss deduction for the adjusted basis in GSH of $1,337,690, but is denied a deduction for the additional $730,786 that he claimed that was owed to him but never paid. All right. So, next case, estate of James Heller. So, let's take a look at this one. The next case we'll look at is the tax court case of the estate of James Heller, deceased Barbara H. Freitag, Harry H. Falk, and Stephen Heller, co-executors versus commissioner. In this case, James Heller was a resident of New York who died in January 2008. At that time, he owned a 99% interest in the James Heller Family LLC, also known as JHF. His son Stephen and daughter Barbara each owned 0.5% of the interest. Harry Falk managed JHF, which contained only one asset, but an account with Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities after the death of James Heller. Stephen, Barbara, and Harry were appointed co-executors of the estate of James Heller. So between March and November 2008, Harry withdrew $11.5 million from the Madoff account and distributed it according to JHF's ownership interests. The estate's share, which was $11,385,000, was used to pay its taxes, and administrative expenses. So far, so good, one might think. However, as we know, on December 11th, 2008, Bernie Madoff, chairman of Madoff Securities, was arrested, and the SEC issued a press release to alert the public that it had charged him with securities fraud relating to a multi-billion-dollar Ponzi scheme. It was $65 billion, I think, at the end of it. As a result of the Ponzi scheme, JHF's interest in the JAF Madoff account and the estate's interest in JHF became worthless. In April of 2009, the estate filed Form 706, United States Estate and Generation Skipping Transfer Tax Return, on which the estate reported a $26,296,807 gross estate, including the value of James Heller's 99% interest in JHF, which was, for example, was $16,560,990. The estate also claimed a $5,175,990 theft loss deduction relating to the Ponzi scheme, which represented the difference between the value of the estate's interest in JHF and the amount of the estate had received from Madoff account during 2008. So, for example, take me 16,560,000 and change minus the 11,385,000 and change equals 5,175,000 and change. The section of the tax code that governs losses by estates is Section Code 2054 or 2054, which says, for the purposes of the tax imposed by Section 2001 or 2001, the value of the taxable estate shall be determined by deducting from the value of the gross estate losses incurred during the settlement estates arising from fires, storms, shipwrecks, and other casualties, or from theft, which such losses are not compensated for by insurance or otherwise. In February 2012, the IRS issued a notice of deficiency in which it determined that the estate was not entitled to the $5,175,000 theft loss deduction because the estate did not incur a theft loss during its settlement. The position of the taxpayers was that although JHF lost its sole asset as a result of the Ponzi scheme, the estate, during its settlement, also suffered a loss because the value of its interest in JHF decreased from $5,175,000 and change to zero. On the other hand, the position of the IRS was that the estate is not entitled to Section Code 2054 deduction because it was JHF that incurred the loss. The court ruled that the estate is indeed entitled to a 2054 deduction relating to its JHF interest because the loss suffered by the estate relates directly to its JHF interest, the worthlessness of which arose from the theft. Okay, moving on. The estate of Bernard Kessel. So, this proceeding in the case of estate of Bernard Kessel, deceased, Iris Steele, executrix versus commissioner, took place in 2014 and concerned Mr. Kessel's personal pension plan, which he had invested with Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities. Mr. Kessel owned a New York corporation in his own name, and in 1982, he created the Bernard Kessel Incorporated Pension Plan, a qualified defined benefit plan. He was the sole participant in the plan. In 1992, he opened an account with Madoff Investments using $610,000 of plan assets. He designated his fiancée, Iris Steele, the primary beneficiary of 70% of his death benefits payable under the plan, and his son, Richard Kessel, the primary beneficiary of 30% of the death benefits payable under the plan. When Mr. Kessel died in 2006, the reading of his will appointed Miss Steele as the executrix of the estate. As part of her duties, Miss Steele contacted Madoff Investments to determine the value of the assets held in the plan accounts. Madoff Investments sent a letter to Miss Steele detailing the number and price of each publicly traded security, money market fund, and option the Madoff account purportedly held. Ms. Steele forwarded this correspondence to an appraisal service, which then prepared an appraisal report stating that the value of these assets was $4,811,853. When filing for an extension for the estate's tax return, Ms. Steele included checks with a total value of $1.6 million as estate estimated tax. When the estate eventually filed its return, it reported that the estate owed some $1.9 million in federal estate tax, somewhat higher than the earlier estimate. The estate eventually paid an extra $367,000 to the IRS in full satisfaction of the unpaid federal estate tax balance, the additions to tax, and the accrued interest that had been assessed. Meanwhile, life went on for the two beneficiaries of the estate. And during the period after the death of Mr. Kessel, his fiancee and son made a total of 7 withdrawals from the Madoff account amounting to more than $2.8 million. The situation was turned on its head when the Madoff Ponzi scheme was exposed in 2008. The plan tried to recover assets reportedly held in the Madoff account, seeking to recover $3,221,057 in securities positions reflected on the Madoff account statement for the month immediately before Madoff's arrest. When this claim was denied by the Madoff trustee, the estate submitted Form 843, Claim for Refund and Request for Abatement, requesting $1.937 million refund. The estate also submitted a supplemental Form 706, which reported the date of the death value for the investment account as zero. The IRS denied the estate's request for a refund and determined that the value of Mr. Kessel's taxable estate was greater than the estate had reported. The estate disputed the IRS refusal of the claim for refund, and the matter eventually found its way into the tax court system. The IRS requested a partial summary judgment in its favor, but the judge ruled against it, noting that a number of the facts in the case are under dispute. For example, at the time of the taxpayer's death, he understood its value to be $4.8 million. How would a reasonable person have grounds to know or suspect that the account was, in fact, worthless? Another matter in dispute is whether it is the plan's Madoff account or the account's purported holdings that are subject to the estate tax. In the judge's opinion, the only way to resolve these questions was to go to a full trial. According to the U.S. Tax Court's site, it appears that a trial was scheduled for March of 2015. However, it seems that the parties settled the cases before the intended trial date. Unfortunately, we were unable to access the details of their agreed settlement. The point remains, however, that resolving Ponzi scheme losses on behalf of investors can be long, drawn out, and an expensive proposition. All right, and so I got all the notes and resources for that in the show notes. Let's see, as discussed in this previous section, numerous taxpayers have been affected by losses from their investments in Ponzi schemes. Although the guidance offered by the IRS is generally very helpful, every case is different. In fact, the whole matter of resolving Ponzi losses for taxpayers is far from being as simple as it may seem and is still being tested in tax court. So far, we have confined our discussion of Ponzi scheme victims to individual investors, but there are also entities that have been caught up in Ponzi schemes through association rather than through direct investment. In this chapter, we'll review 2 cases where banks and financial professionals have played a role in the operation of a Ponzi scheme. We're going to be able to identify the roles played by banks in the operation of Ponzi schemes and identify the types of internal operational procedures that banks and tax preparation firms should have in place when doing business. So the first case is Toronto Dominion Bank and some other banks. So in the early 2000s, the Canadian bank Toronto Dominion Bank was a participant in the standard Ponzi scheme, along with several other banks throughout the financial services they offered to investors in the scheme. So Texas tycoon R. Allen Stanford was a mastermind of a 20-year Ponzi scheme via his offshore bank in Antigua, cheating almost 30,000 investors for more than 100 countries out of billions of dollars. The scam involved fake CDs, and prosecutors accused Stanford of funneling funds to his personal interests including real estate and cricket tournaments. The following article from CNN Business Pages describes the bank's connections to the case and the penalties they suffered. TD Bank reaches a $1.2 billion settlement in the Ponzi scheme lawsuit. February 27, 2023, New York, let's see here. TD Bank will pay $1.2 billion to settle lawsuit alleging its involvement in an infamous $7 billion Ponzi scheme orchestrated by disgraced financier Alan Stanford more than a decade ago. So TD Bank, did you notice how long it took? Agreed to pay $1.205 billion to a court-appointed receiver who will, in turn, pay back victims of the scheme, but denied any wrongdoing, the bank said in a statement. So Stanford was sentenced to 110 years in prison in 2012 after being found guilty on 13 counts of fraud-related charges in Houston. Prosecutors charged that Stanford sold billions of dollars in fraudulent CDs, or certificates of deposit, administered by Stanford International Bank Ltd. Or Limited, an offshore bank in Antigua, ensnaring thousands of victims. The lawsuit claimed TD Bank collected these deposits in US and Canadian dollar values and continuously ignored red flags about the Antigua bank over the years. As has been the case throughout these proceedings, TD expressly denies any liability or wrongdoing with respect to the multi-year Ponzi scheme operated by Stanford and makes no admission in connection to any Stanford matter as part of the settlement, the Canadian bank said in a statement. TD provided primarily correspondent banking services to Stanford International Bank Limited and maintains it acted properly at all times, the bank said. So the settlement announcement comes the same day the banks were scheduled for trial in Houston federal court, averting the trial. Additionally, HSBC will pay $40 million and Independent Bank, formerly Bank of Houston, will pay $100 million to the receivership counsel confirmed. HSBC is pleased to have resolved this claim, which relates to the matters over a decade old, with no admission of any liability or wrongdoing, the bank said in a statement. So Independent Bank did not immediately respond to a request for comment in a securities filing. The firm denied liability or wrongdoing. Investors allege 5 banks: Trustmark, TD, Bank of Houston, now Independent Bank Corp., HSBC, and Societe Generale Private Banking, or Suisse, knew or should have known about the alleged fraud perpetrated by Stanford, and that they aided and abetted the disgraced financier in the 20-year scheme. The latest settlement brings the total recoveries amount to more than $1.6 billion. Given all the challenges faced by the receiverships since 2009, this is nothing short of a monumental recovery, said Kevin Sadler, lead counsel for the receiver, in a statement. TD said it agreed to settle to avoid the distraction and certainty of continuing a long legal proceeding. Clients of Stanford were told that the CDs that they purchased averaged a rate of return of 3 to 4% higher than the US CDs, and that the bank made safe investments in products like stocks and bonds, but the money was actually used to fund the Texas tycoon's lavish lifestyle, including multiple homes in the Caribbean and the US. Societe Generale reached a settlement of $157 million, and Trustmark agreed to pay $100 million earlier this year. Although these banks connected to the Stanford scheme did not suffer losses from their own investments, they were implicated in the scheme because they enabled its operation by providing related financial services. They also collected commissions and fees for their services, and they were accused of ignoring red flags that could have alerted them to the ongoing fraudulent nature of Stanford's business operations. Proving in court allegations such as these of the banks turning a blind eye while continuing to rake in fees and commissions would be an expensive and time-consuming process for all parties concerned. Agreeing to settlements such as they did allows the banks to cut their losses and quickly return to business as usual. It may be hard for an individual investor who has lost his life savings to sympathize with the banks, but they were victims to some extent, suffering collateral damage from their involvement in Stanford's Ponzi scheme. While TD Bank and others could claim they were unaware and had no reason to suspect they were helping with the Ponzi scheme, the bank in our next example could hardly claim such naivete. Umpqua Bank. This regional bank, based in Portland, Oregon, seemed to be very growth driven in its business operations, which perhaps resulted in its internal controls being less stringent than would have been prudent. The bank made headlines in 2022 when it was accused of providing its services to a Ponzi scheme. The following article from the Seattle Times describes the background of the accusation. So, Umpqua Bank accused of aiding a massive Ponzi scheme again, February 17th, 2022, for the third time in just over a decade. Portland-based Umpqua Bank has been accused of aiding and abetting a massive Ponzi scheme that cost investors millions of dollars. The latest involved Kenneth J. Casey, a prominent investor, philanthropist, and political contributor in Marin County, a wealthy enclave north of San Francisco. Upon Casey's death in May of 2020, the executor of the estate discovered that Casey and an associate operated a decades-long Ponzi scheme through which he defrauded more than 1,000 victims. The case illustrates one of the potential pitfalls of rapid expansion. Umpqua grew from a tiny bank in Canyonville, Oregon, to one of the largest Northwest banks, thanks to a rapid-fire series of acquisitions. Umpqua is set to merge this year with Columbia Banking System, a bank based out of Tacoma, Washington. In a lawsuit, lawyers from the investors said Umpqua bankers were well aware of the Ponzi scheme and repeatedly enabled it by moving money from investors into the personal accounts of Casey. One bank employee, the complaint said, even telephoned Casey to alert him that an attorney for one of his clients was calling the bank to complain about him. That Umpqua would do business with Casey was unusual, given that in 1997, Casey was sentenced to 18 months in prison after pleading guilty to charges that included bank fraud and tax evasion. So there's a red flag that was ignored. Umpqua does not publicly comment on matters related to cases currently in litigation, the bank said in a written statement. This is not the first time that Umpqua has been accused of facilitating fraudsters. In 2014, a bankruptcy trustee sued Umpqua and 3 other Oregon banks, saying they helped cover up an ongoing Ponzi scheme at Eugene-based Burjack of Oregon and insurance financing business that went bankrupt in 2012, costing investors $40 million. Shortly after the Burjack scandal came to light, Bend-based Summit Accommodators collapsed into a similar scandal. The company's executives had for years been diverting cash it held for its customers and using it to invest in Central Oregon real estate. Investors' court-appointed trustee sued Umpqua, alleging top executives knew about the scheme. Umpqua paid millions to settle the cases, though it did not admit wrongdoing. Most of the victims of Casey's scam are in the Bay Area. Many of them elderly, said Linda Lamb, the Oakland-based lead attorney for the plaintiffs. Many of the thousands of investors are seniors who invested a ton of money from their retirement, Lamb said. We really want to see Umpqua pay the price to make these people whole. At the time of this writing, the lawsuit against Umpqua Bank has not been resolved. However, according to some background information associated with the filing of the suit, Umpqua may find it much more difficult to plead ignorance than was the case for TD and the other banks we saw earlier. So evidence shows that Umpqua's involvement in the PFI's Ponzi scheme. So after Ken Casey died in May of 2020, his Ponzi scheme was almost immediately uncovered. For more than a decade, Casey and his partner, Louis Wallach, had convinced individuals, many from the Bay Area, to invest in PFI and PISF by promising them steady returns for investments and ensuring them that their money would be used to purchase and maintain real estate in Marin County and Sonoma County. In reality, PFI and PISF were operating at a massive deficit and surviving only by continually raising new investor money to pay existing investors. Casey and Wallach ran their scheme entirely through Umpqua Bank's Novato brand. Investors therefore filed suit against Umpqua, alleging that Casey was only able to keep his Ponzi scheme going for so long because the bank was aiding and abetting the fraud, excuse me. Plaintiffs allege that while other banks declined to accept PFI and PISF as customers because Casey's history of financial crime, Umpqua agreed to look the other way. Plaintiffs allege that Umpqua provided special treatment to PFI and one of the top bank's customers, and that a banker at Umpqua was intimately familiar with PFI because she worked on the business accounts for over a decade. This banker allegedly knew investor money was placed in a particular account and would transfer investor money from that account for Casey's personal benefit and for the benefit of existing investors. It was not only until Casey died that an outsider had a view of PFI's financials that the Ponzi scheme was uncovered. At that point, Casey and Wallach had been running their Ponzi operation through Umpqua for at least 13 years. And Umpqua's alleged cooperation had caused investors hundreds of millions of dollars in damages. If these allegations of Umpqua Bank's involvement in the Casey Ponzi scheme are found out to be true, it may be difficult to call the bank an unwitting victim of the fraudster. So that's according to the Seattle Times and Cass Law Group. And so those resources will be available. So all of the banks discussed in these two cases could have avoided the financial penalties associated with dealing with Ponzi schemes if they'd followed their internal procedures and conducted thorough background checks on the parties with whom they were dealing. One can perhaps understand the temptation to ignore red flags and simply continue to do business. But apart from the eventual cost to the bank when the fraud is uncovered, there are also thousands of investors whose finances are being drained because of the bank's inaction. So, earlier we discussed the Ponzi scheme operated in Texas by the money doctor. As you will recall, the key figure presented himself not only as an expert investor, but also as a devout Christian who lived in the Dallas-Fort Worth area and cared deeply about his neighbors. So much did he care about his neighbors, the pitch went, that he would take their safe money and invest it for them in financial instruments that were guaranteed not to lose money. As we know, the lifeblood of a Ponzi scheme is the steady inflow of new investors and new funds. The money doctor advertised for new investors through his radio infomercials and through the word of mouth. After the fraudulent nature of the investments was revealed, investigators asked a number of victims about why they invested with the money doctor. A significant number of victims replied that they heard about the money doctor through their tax preparer, CPA. Although there is no reason for us to suggest or imply that these recommendations were made with anything but good intentions in mind, remember that Circular 230 authorizes us only to practice before the IRS. To quote the relevant passages from Circular 230, practice before the Internal Revenue Code Service comprehends all matters connected with the presentation to the Internal Revenue Service or any of its officers or employees related to a taxpayer's rights, privileges, or liabilities under laws or regulations administered by the Internal Revenue Service. Such presentations include, but are not limited to, preparing documents, filing documents, corresponding and communicating with the IRS, rendering written advice with respect to any entity, transaction, plan or arrangement, or other plan or arrangement having a potential for tax avoidance or evasion, and representing a client at conferences, hearings, and meetings. There is no mention of tax preparers being authorized by Circular 230 to offer financial or investment advice. Offering advice on investments is best left to those professionals who are qualified in the field. Most of us are qualified in the field of taxation, not in the fields of financial planning and investment. For that reason, we should politely decline to offer investment advice when asked for it. Otherwise, we risk sounding like those clients who tell us that they are eligible for the earned income tax credit because their neighbor's brother-in-law told them that everyone's getting it, so it must be good. Treasury Department Circular number 230, Rev 6-2014, Regulations Governing Practices Before the Internal Revenue Service 10.2. So, overall, in summary, we discussed the role played in the operation of Ponzi schemes by parties other than the fraudster and his individual investors. From the cases reviewed, we saw that certain banks and certain financial professionals have played a role in defrauding investors, either intentionally or unintentionally. For both types of businesses, an internal set of procedures to prevent the enabling of fraudsters should not only be in place, but also be enacted and enforced. With that, I'm going to end this section, IRS Guidance, Part 3. We did Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, and I hope you guys have found this information helpful, informative, and educational. And I really appreciate you guys tuning in to the Northbound Wealth Podcast. This is an extended version of an education piece that I wanted to put out for you at the beginning of 2025. All right. Thank you so much for listening. It's never too early to start learning. So students, teachers, and parents, you've come to the right place. Investor.gov, Northbound Wealth Management will be an advocate for you too to learn more about investing. There's a section on the investor.gov website where they talk about the resources for investors. There's a list and links, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau link, Financial Literacy Education Commission. There's links to that, Financial Planning Association, Investor Protection Trust, and the North American Securities Administrators Association, and USA.gov, saveandinvest.org. There's just a lot out there. And the SEC's Office of Investor Education and Advocacy provides a variety of services and tools to address problems you may face as an investor. That's their whole main mission and purpose. They have investor alerts focused on recent investment frauds and scams, and investor bulletins focused on topical issues, including recent commission actions. And they're provided as a service to the public. They are neither interpretations nor statements of SEC policy. And so they're all about investor education, and I'm all for that. Lord knows we need it. All right. So thank you for tuning in to this podcast, and I hope you found this helpful and potentially useful. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to Northbound Wealth Management. We'd be happy to answer them. 317-399-1107, or check us out on the web at www.northboundwealth.com.